But we would read our own story into the text, and we understood that if the narrative ended this way, in a particular way for the Hebrews, then we believed it would end this way for us. So if God rescued the Hebrews from bondage, then we believe that God would rescue us from bondage. If God abhorred the slavery in Egypt, then God abhors slavery in the United States and oppression in the United States. And those types of readings empowered us. Now, we didn't originate those types of readings. You have to know that the Puritans themselves understood themselves as living through the Exodus story. They saw tyranny in Europe, tyranny in Britain, and read that as ancient Egypt, and saw their journey to the New World as a journey across the Jordan to Canaan. Now, as African Americans, when we pick up the story, we generally pick up the first 14 chapters, that is the slavery in Egypt and freedom at the Red Sea.
How we got over.
That's right. The Puritans, however, picked up the next part of the text. That is, they became God's military arm, cleaning out Canaan. And they lived that out in relation to the Native Americans. And so we see very different readings and gravitation toward very different parts of the Exodus story, with the Puritans and then and later successive generations of Americans and African Americans in the ways that we took up the text, primarily for freedom and then toward uplift. So two very different ways of taking up the text. What was interesting to me, what has always been interesting to me growing up, is how the Bible can mean one thing to one congregation or one group of people or one region of the nation, and the same biblical text can mean something entirely different to another congregation, to a congregation next door, down the street, or in another region. And so in the United States, we have not only red states and blue states, but we have red congregations and blue congregations reading from the same text, believing entirely differently about who God is and God's activity in the world and how we should respond to God's activity in the world. So in my book, I look at ways that, my recent book, Pillars of Cloud and Fire, I look at ways that African Americans have taken up the text, beginning in the antebellum period, just before the Civil War. And so I look at, for example, in the antebellum period, African Americans read the text and understood that the Promised Land was emancipation, and once emancipation came in 1865. We began to reconfigure our understanding of Exodus. We held on to the same story, but the Promised Land then became uplift. How do we find a way to gain some economic status, educational status? How do we raise our quality of life in a world that still hates us? And so from 1865 up until the Harlem Renaissance, during the era of Reconstruction, you find African Americans reading the Exodus story still, but no longer talking about emancipation, but the Promised Land became uplift. In the Harlem Renaissance, you find figures like Zora Neale Hurston in her book Moses, Man of the Mountain, and others, taking up the Exodus story again, but this time no longer talking about uplift, but talking about what it means to be the Harlem Renaissance's new Negro.
That's creative in a real sense.
Creative, but what does it mean to become a new person absent the manacles of slavery? How do we pull off the vestiges of slavery? And that was at a time when in American popular culture, you saw Sambos, you saw Pickaninnies, you saw all of those, Jemimas, all of those, blackface, all those stereotypical figures used to advertise products. They were all a part of the cultural landscape. And the Harlem Renaissance writers wanted to produce a more authentic representation, as they saw it, of African American cultural life. And so for them, who is this new Negro, this new African American person who is not seen through the stereotypes of the white gaze, but seen in a way that is authentically herself or himself. And Zora Neale Hurston works hard. Langston Hughes does the same thing, but Zora Neale Hurston focuses on the Exodus story in a powerful way. She reconfigures in I think a novel-length sermon, really, reconfigures the Exodus story in a way that speaks to empowerment for African Americans and offers a critique of leadership and empowers the people. So if you haven't read Moses, Man of the Mountain, powerful, powerful. And so once the Harlem Renaissance sort of dies down after the Great Depression, of course, and then we get into World War II, we begin the Civil Rights Movement. And here now, African Americans begin to rethink again, what is this promised land and what is slavery? Slavery is not being enslaved. It's not what it meant to live life in Reconstruction. But now slavery is living under Jim Crow. And the promised land is, what does it mean to have the Voting Rights Act, the Public Accommodations Bill? The promised land becomes comes signified by the word integration. But I think that word integration doesn't quite capture it. Actually, what African Americans were fighting for was freedom. How can we be free to live peaceably in our own communities? Can we be free to be treated as equal citizens in the United States? And so civil rights and civil attainment become the metaphor for the promised land. And so as African American preachers talked about the promised land, it was about ending Jim Crow. It was about ending segregation. It was about finding new ways of living as first-class citizens with equal rights. And then finally in the Black Power era, just after the death of Dr. King, after the assassination, we find again African Americans reconfiguring this Exodus story, and particularly folk like Reverend Albert Clegg.
And so what we'll do, we'll take this final break and then we'll come back and continue.